You're listening to the Dead Presidents Podcast.
And this is the top 5 presidential last words.
5, we're about to take a dive. 4, in the presidential lore. 3, who will the top 5 be? 2, we're about to tell you. 1, the show's not begun.
Welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I am James J. Hamilton.
And I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
Last things first. This week's top 5 list is a very morbid list in a way, but also
Indeed it is, Jim.
hopeful. We're bringing you the top 5 presidential last words.
That's right.
One thing that all dead presidents have in common, they died.
That's right.
And some of them were spitting some truth and knowledge as they went out the door or had
That's for sure.
other interesting things to say.
That's for sure. And let's jump right into it. It's the top 5 presidential last words.
Number 5.
James Madison.
James Madison was our 4th president, as you know, from the 4th episode. In 1836, he was 85 years old. He had been crippled by rheumatism. His health had declined. Through the last 6 months of his life, he became very weak.
Yeah, he was having a hard time. He hung in there.
Yeah, it was late June of 1836, and his doctor offered to give him stimulants to keep him alive until July 4th, because the last 3 presidents who died, Adams, Jefferson, and, spoiler alert, James Monroe,
Right, yeah.
all died on July 4th.
Yeah.
So it was becoming
Pretty
like...
crazy. So they were like, do you want us to try and make sure this happens?
Yeah, let's try to keep this streak going.
Yeah.
But Madison said, no, I'm not trying to artificially
Like, this
die
is
on the
crazy.
4th. He refused, and it was June 28th, 1836. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning. He was having breakfast. He seemed to be having trouble swallowing. His niece asked him, "What's the matter, Uncle James?" And he said, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." Then his head dropped, and he was dead. From heart failure.
Yeah.
That was his final words. "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear."
Pretty cool.
Yeah, I really like those last words.
Yeah, that's pretty cool because, like, for me, I would look at it as, like, we talked about James Madison in the last episode. We know. And our listeners know, like, what an intellect he was. And so for him to prescribe death to nothing more but a change of mind is pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's as if he was, like, changing his mind about staying alive. Or, like, what else was he thinking about right before then that he changed his mind on? It's pretty mysterious.
Yeah,
Man,
or it
that's-
was just life into death was nothing more than a change of mind. Pretty profound.
Yeah. We have an also honorable mention for his last written words that he intended to be his final statement. He wrote a brief message that he left for posthumous publication, which he said may be considered as issuing from my tomb. So here's a president who has post-last words issuing from beyond the grave.
Yeah.
It was entitled Advice to My Countrymen, and it said, "The advice nearest to my heart and deepest in my convictions is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. Let the open enemy to it be regarded as Pandora with her box open, and the disguised one as the serpent creeping with his deadly wiles into paradise."
Oof.
Hopefully that's not the thing he changed his mind about. at the
Yeah,
last
I don't
minute.
know. That's pretty...
The
Pretty
union,
deep.
the union is eternal.
Yeah.
Not changing his mind about that.
Yeah. I mean, the Civil War would have broke most of the Founding Fathers' hearts. Madison amongst them.
Certainly.
But that brings us to top 5 presidential last words.
Number 4.
Zachary Taylor. I regret nothing, but I am sorry to leave my friends. Our 12th president, Zachary Taylor, didn't die on the 4th of July, but he did die of complications arising from the 4th of July. Taylor had only been in office for 16 months when he attended July 4th festivities at the Washington Monument, which was then just beginning to be constructed. The cornerstone basically was there, and they were starting work on it. He was outside in the heat for hours, and by the time he returned to the White House, he was very, very hungry and incredibly thirsty. Quote, according to the traditional account, he wolfed down a large bowl of cherries and a pitcher of iced milk. Later that day, he developed severe cramps.
Those cherries and milk not sitting well.
No, they were not sitting well, and as a matter of fact, he was diagnosed with cholera morbus, aka acute gastroenteritis, aka infectious diarrhea.
Yuck.
And here's the thing about that. It was common in Washington, D.C. You're talking really poor sanitation at this point. So anytime you would eat quote-unquote fresh or raw fruit or fresh quote-unquote dairy products during the summer, there was a risk that it could be bacterially infected.
Yeah, it's a sultry swamp atmosphere.
That's it.
That's why actually Congress was held mostly in the winter.
Right.
At the beginning, because the weather in Washington, D.C. was so unhealthy in the summer.
Yeah. So, Taylor, he disregards all of that and decides he's gonna eat a bunch of cherries and, iced milk.
He's chowing down.
To refresh himself. That turned out to be a really bad decision because over the next few days, Taylor suffered from increasingly severe diarrhea and vomiting. Doctors gave him calomel and opium and quinine. They administered the state-of-the-art treatments of blistering and bleeding. Strangely, this didn't help.
Man, I want to go to the hospital today and get blistering and bleeding done to me.
And despite that,
it's the classic treatment for diarrhea.
Yeah, for sure. But despite the best treatment known to man, Taylor continued to decline. Can you imagine? On the evening of July 9th, 1850, Taylor realized he was going to die. And he uttered his last words. Quote, I am about to die. I expect the summons very soon. I have tried to discharge my duties faithfully. I regret nothing, but I am sorry to leave my friends. He probably should have regretted consuming those cherries and that iced milk.
Yep.
Soon thereafter, he expired at the age of 65. He was the second president to die in office and the first president to bloodily shit himself to death. Taylor's final illness likely holds the unofficial record for the worst smell ever to beset the White House. His sick room was undoubtedly a putrid, malodorous nightmare in which the air was saturated by a miasmic cloud of rancid, infectious particles of presidential death shit.
Yikes.
Soon after his death, a conspiracy theory developed. Some said Taylor's symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning, and rumors circulated that he'd been poisoned by pro-slavery Southerners. At the time, There was a controversy over the extension of slavery to the Western territories just acquired in the Mexican-American War. Taylor, though a slave owner, seemed increasingly sympathetic to the abolitionist side. However, he never got the chance to see it through.
Was it foul play?
Well, in 1991, Taylor's body was exhumed and tests revealed no elevated levels of arsenic. The conspiracy seemed debunked, although it's been argued that the testing was flawed. So for some reason, this mystery persists, Jim.
People can believe what they want to believe.
I reckon so.
But Taylor had no regrets.
No.
Not one.
I suppose not.
That's a good sentiment to have when you're dying. I would hope to feel that
the
way.
same way. Yeah. I could
that's-
admire that. And that's going to bring us to top 5 presidential last words.
Number 3.
Grover Cleveland.
Grover Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms. He is our 22nd and 24th president.
And don't you forget it.
He's also the only Democratic president between the Civil War and 1912. Cleveland was one of the fattest presidents, really second only to William Howard Taft.
Right.
Cleveland tipped the scales at up to 280 pounds. 10 years after he left office, he hit his 70s and a lifetime of gluttony.
Yeah,
Put
like
up with it.
there's pictures of him as a young man, and I mentioned this in a previous episode in the top 5, where we were talking about Francis Folsom Cleveland, and yeah, Grover Cleveland was a decently built dude, and then a penchant for beer and heavy eating just totally fucked him.
Yeah.
And he just ballooned up into this no-necked ball of a man.
Yeah. He fell ill with heart and kidney troubles exacerbated by gastric difficulties and gout. On June 24th, 1908, Cleveland suffered a heart attack, and just before he shuffled off this mortal coil, uttered his last words, "I have tried so hard to do right."
Some great last words, and I also like that we could also throw in another old saying, and my gram used to say this all the time, was before I shuffle off to Buffalo.
Yeah.
Because Cleveland was the mayor of Buffalo, so shuffling off the mortal coil and shuffling off to Buffalo, yeah.
Sweet.
Exchangeable.
Yep, he perished with his beloved wife, Frances Folsom Cleveland, at his side. As you recall, he was, in episode 3, the number 1 presidential cradle robber.
Right.
Strived his whole life to do right. And one thing he probably thought he did right was marry a woman 28 years younger than himself,
Yeah.
whom he'd known since she was an infant. After Cleveland's death, then President Teddy Roosevelt said, quote, "The nation has been deprived of one of its greatest citizens."
It's pretty powerful coming from TR.
Yep.
About somebody of the opposition party, but supposedly they were actually friends.
Yeah, they got along when...
They really did. In the biography that I read of Cleveland, they were known as collectively the Big One and the Dude.
Yeah, Cleveland was governor of New York when TR was in New York state politics, and
Right.
they really did get along. They're kind of that cross-partisan, almost progressive, beginnings of the progressive era.
Yeah,
vibe.
they could have been a great team.
Yeah. Hell of a pair of mustaches on that team.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, good last words from a president. I've tried so hard to do right. That's
Yeah.
a good thing for a president to
And I believe it,
be
too. I don't
trying
think
at
that's
and
bullshit.
hopefully not agonizing too hard over at his death.
This is going to bring us around to my personal favorite last words. I felt that this could have been number one. In my book, it's number one, but we are a democracy here at the Dead Presidents podcast, and we had to factor in a lot of things. But in terms of last words, you try and look at the meaning behind them, if it was profound, or if it was just, And this is the epitome of the latter.
Yeah.
And it's going to bring us around to top 5 presidential last words.
Number 2.
Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore had been the vice president under Zachary Taylor, and he was elevated to the office of president when Zachary Taylor ignominiously shit himself to death.
Call back to number 4.
Correct. He signed into law the Compromise of 1850 and a new fugitive slave law.
Just like the Southerners who assassinated Taylor by poison wanted.
That's right. And
Theoretically.
we'll talk all about this in episodes 12 and 13.
Conspiratorially.
That's right. So, in 1852, the Whig Party declined to nominate Millard Fillmore for a term in his own right. In 1856, as a result of this, he ran as a third-party candidate from the Know Nothing Party. And if you are into cinema and you've seen Gangs of New York, Bill the Butcher supports the Know Nothing candidate.
Yep. We don't know nothing. That's their platform.
That's about it. And as a third-party candidate, Fillmore would actually win the state of Maryland.
Yep.
He remained a staunch Unionist throughout the Civil War, and in February of 1874, at the age of 74, Fillmore was enjoying seemingly perfect health when he suffered a stroke. He was shaving, his left hand fell powerless to his side, and the paralysis spread to the left side of his face. He was having difficulty breathing and swallowing. 2 weeks later, he suffered another debilitating stroke. As his end approached on March 8, 1874, he was eating something when his doctor asked him a question, and he responded with what would be his last words. "The nourishment is palatable." One of the most badass ways to describe good food. Everyone should start saying that. I do it.
The nourishment is palatable.
Yeah. The last words of Millard Fillmore. What was he eating? I'd love to know. Maybe some soup? Something that would go down easy because his throat was affected. So I imagine it was soup. And, how is it? The nourishment is palatable.
Yeah, whoever prepared that meal was probably pretty proud that was the presidential last words, complimenting the chef.
Complimenting that meal. So, I wager that ought to be the official presidential last words of Thanksgiving dinner. If I were the White House chef, I'd have that quote tattooed across my forehead, James.
It's the highest ambition of a White House chef.
Indeed.
Please the president's palate.
That's it. And after uttering his last words, Fillmore declined rapidly and died later that night, surrounded by family and friends. In her period of mourning, the new Mrs. Fillmore probably had lots of people bring her food, as is traditional, and we are willing to bet that the nourishment was palatable.
That's a phrase we all need to start adding into our vocabularies. It's very presidential.
Right into the lexicon. Absolutely. And that's going to bring us around to the top 5 presidential last words.
Number 1.
John Quincy Adams.
John Quincy Adams was the 6th president from 1825 to 29, and he then became the only ex-president to be elected to the House of Representatives.
Yeah, pretty huge deal.
Yep, where he served from 1831 until his death in 1848, distinguishing himself as a vocal opponent of slavery.
Right.
In 1846, he was partially paralyzed by a stroke, but made a full recovery. When he returned to the House chamber in 1847, everyone stood up and applauded.
Yeah.
At the age of 80, his health continued to deteriorate, but he kept working right up until the end. And we're going to quote from Paul C. Nagel's excellent biography of John Quincy Adams on his final moments. At the accustomed hour, the carriage was brought round to take him to the Capitol, where his coachman watched with amazement at the vigor with which Adams climbed the steps. But then, an hour later, his long career closed in a fashion that might have given him some satisfaction. As House business got underway, Adams responded one last time. Still opposed to the ongoing Mexican War, he voted no, in a voice scarcely muffled by age, when his name was called on a measure that would have commended veterans of recent battles. Then, as the clerk proceeded to read a tribute to these soldiers, Adams tried to rise and address the speaker. Although he got partway to his feet, he could make no sound. Instead, as a deep flush suffused his temples, he clutched at his desk and began to topple. Members of the House shouted a warning, and a colleague caught him before he struck the floor. It was 1:30 in the afternoon of Monday, February 21st, 1848. Barely conscious, he was carried first to a sofa and then to the Speaker's private chamber. There he lingered for 2 days.
Can you imagine that happening in the middle of a session?
Yeah, not only a representative, but an ex-president.
It's an ex-president.
The most famous guy in the House, pretty much.
Right. I mean, this guy is the one who has the most solid legacy, for sure.
Yeah, he drops, and then he spends 2 days in the Speaker of the House's office. They don't take him somewhere else. He stays.
They're too afraid to move him.
Yeah, he's messed up. And in one of his few alert moments, it was Henry Clay he asked to greet. The old Kentuckian arrived in time to bid his friend a tearful farewell. First Lady Louisa Adams was less fortunate, for her husband did not recognize her when she was brought to the Capitol to see him.
Wow.
He died at 7:15 p.m. on February 23rd. Word of his death was sent immediately to admirers in such distant places as Ohio and Maine, thanks to recently strung telegraph lines.
Yeah.
These bulletins featured the fallen hero's last words, for at the moment of his death those gathered at his side heard him mutter a sentence. Some claimed he murmured, "This is the end of earth, but I am content." To others he seemed to say, "This is the last of earth, I am composed." Both dying assertions are widely repeated, although the second seems more likely correct, according to Paul C. Nagel. In all his life, Adams was never content. It was a word he rarely used, for he was one of the least easily satisfied men in history. On the other hand, he always sought, and often failed, to find self-control. Death should have brought the moment when he would most wish to account himself composed.
Wow. That's pretty huge.
There's some pretty badass last words.
They really are.
This is the last of earth. I am composed. I like that
Which
phrase.
seems the more likely. I like to think that that is what it was.
Yeah, almost being content at your minute of death seems like an enviable state, but that's really not what John Quincy Adams was all
Adams'
about.
character.
Being-
that doesn't jive with him.
Being
as a person, I don't
composed
think.
and meeting the end with composure
Yeah.
is probably the most we can hope for.
That makes a lot more sense.
I also like the phrase, "This is the last of Earth," as if there's going to be something else after Earth. As far as John Quincy Adams' existence goes, the Earth part of it is now over.
It's done.
The next part is just about to begin. Wherever John Quincy Adams is, we're sure he listens to the Dead Presidents podcast.
That's for sure.
He was a big fan of the episode 2, John Adams episode. He's going to be an even bigger fan of next week's episode 6, John Quincy Adams. Little spoiler alert how that episode's going to end. This is how he's going to die, and he's going to spit out some baller last words.
That's it. And we have some honorable mentions.
Yeah, lots of great presidential last words.
There really are.
It was hard to narrow it down.
Look, the people were presidents, so people went out of their way, when they were dying, to try and record their last sentiments, their last words. I mean, it didn't always work out, somebody like Reagan, didn't know who the hell he was for a decade before he died, So his last words were probably, really stupid, but there's a lot of great ones. And so let's bring up some honorable mentions. First off, we have James K. Polk, whose last words were a sentiment to his beloved wife, Sarah Childress. And he said his last words on Earth, "I love you, Sarah, for all eternity. I love you."
It's nice.
That's pretty deep. And she was, we talked about John Adams and Abigail Adams. Sarah Polk was another one that she was her husband's closest confidant. They were a real team, and you don't always have that with presidents and first ladies, but with Abigail Adams, with Sarah Polk, with Dolly Madison.
Yeah.
To a certain extent. Not so much, I don't think, with Dolly. It was just her own personality, set her apart. But in terms of, serious confidants, you can't do any better than John and Abigail Adams and James and Sarah Polk. And so, for his last words to be dedicated to her, it's super deep, because Polk's only passion in his entire life was politics.
Mm-hmm.
He had no room for anything else. He's more of a machine than a man. But really. And so for his last words to be something heartfelt and personal is against character, really.
Well, it shows you, I guess, that behind his obsession with politics, there was the deep love for his first lady.
That's
who aided him in his obsession. Probably the favorite last words on behalf of first ladies.
Yeah.
We also have another honorable mention, William McKinley, whose last words were, "Goodbye all, goodbye. It is God's way. His will be done." Those words, of course, uttered after he had been shot by Leon Solgas.
Yeah.
Death by assassination. Most presidents who go out that way, well, don't have the opportunity to utter knowing last words.
Yeah.
Those of JFK and Lincoln were just comments on what was happening when something very sudden removed their ability to speak. But McKinley got to process that he was being assassinated.
Yeah, he knew. He lingered for a little bit. And
he,
you know,
he blamed God. No, he said it was God's way.
No.
His
Wow.
will be done.
So yeah, Mckinley knew what was going on. He was fully cognizant of the fact that somebody had tried to assassinate him, and that as a result, he was likely going to die. There was a brief period of a day or two where he seemed to rebound, and then it just tanked. McKinley was shot on September 6th, 1901, and died September 14th of the same year.
Another honorable mention, Woodrow Wilson said, "When the machinery is broken, I am ready.
That's a pretty cool one.
This body has no more ability to carry me through this life.
Yeah.
So I'm ready to go."
Well, he had a pretty debilitating stroke that we'll obviously spend some time covering in the Woodrow Wilson episode.
Yep.
That resulted in him being questionably able to perform his duties as president.
Yeah.
And I mean, the questionable thing is big. Huge.
Yeah, it was towards the end of his term, and I don't think he lasted much longer after he left office. You also have Dwight Eisenhower said, "I want to go. God take me." Good sentiment. Also, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "I have a terrific headache," minutes before he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage.
Yeah. Along with his
He felt it.
secretary lover.
He felt it coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, those words probably said to Lucy Mercer, not Eleanor Roosevelt.
That's right.
We hope you'll stick around for our next top 5.
Come to think of it, James, I have a terrific headache.
Well, I hope Stephen Lincoln Douglas sticks around for our next top 5 as well and doesn't die of a cerebral hemorrhage before the next episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast.